Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots in Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our great sponsors, Your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abiativo Casa. And today I have a great guest, John Clarkin. So welcome, John. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Bob, for having me.
So I see you have an Italian scene behind you.
I do. I do. It was taken on a recent trip. This is the Via della Cucagna, which leads to where my grandfather was born.
That's super. That's so cool. That's so cool. So, when and why did you get started doing your research?
Well, it's I retired in 2020 just in time for COVID, and so I needed something to keep my brain going. I didn't want it to turn to polenta, and so I had to find something that was going to be interesting and challenging and meaningful. And so when I got through all of that, it was really the bottom line was that I wanted to make sure my grandfather was never forgotten.
Yeah, and I think that's why we all do it. Some of us get the calling early, some of us get it late. I started before I retired. But to your point, I started doing this because I said, well, what am I going to do to keep myself busy? And I started the blog, which was one way, and now this thing, I think I've done close to 300 interviews now, and it's just so much fun to hear everybody's stories.
Oh, it's amazing, and I just happened to watch the video that you did with Anthony, and that just it was such a meaningful thing to have these stories told in the first person, and describing things. His passing was really a sad event.
Yeah, that's for sure. And he was such a great guy, and he helped me in lots of different ways. And we were going to do so much together with the audio tapes because he had so many of them. I think I don't know, he
Hmm.
had like 100 hours or something like that. But I'm friends with a good friend of his, and I'm hoping at some point in time we could revive that. But and those people, the people came in the 1900, you
Yeah.
know,
Hmm. Yeah,
quite an
that's
interesting story.
really is.
So what did you when you started doing your research? Well, first let me ask this question: how far back were you able to go?
Well, I got back to about 1800, and that was based on the online research I was able to do through the Portali Antenati. Um, and you find death records that would take the births back that far. But really, a unification in 1875 kind of was the beginning of the Antonati records. I was able to find church records that went back beyond that, but I haven't digested the last batch of church records yet. I've been occupied with the civil records, so when I get into the church records, uh, that'll take me back further. But then on this last trip, I met my third cousin, Carlo Ippoliti, and he had a friend that visited the Vatican Museum, and he was able to chase back his direct lines back into the 1400s. So, and as I described one of these documents that I received on my last visit, um, there was a scholar that had access to these records that segregated things by name, by surname, and he has notes in there from the mid 1400s of my grandfather's surname.
Oh, that's great to be able to find that. That's super. Now, did you always know where your grandfather came from, the town?
I knew the town as growing up, and I was fortunate, in that I'm the eldest of 13 grandchildren, and so I got spend 35 years with him outside of my professional career and my military service. Um, but I spent a great deal of time with him, and he never wanted to talk about his past like so many others. So what I knew was he came from a small town called Faleria in Viterbo province, just outside of Rome, and I knew that he was in the army. And beyond that, we never talked about those sort of things. We talked about the present and the future. So it was up to me to dig it out, and I didn't do hardly any of it until well after he passed.
Yeah, that's so great to be able to have that relationship for so long. My parents were on the tail end of both families. My mother was the next to youngest and my father was the youngest. So, my grandparents were already older. My
Mhm.
mother's mom lived the longest, and I used to play cards with her when I was a kid, and I never thought to ask her about Italy because she would have probably been very forthcoming if I had asked.
Mhm.
She didn't volunteer, and I could kick myself that I didn't ask more. Uh,
Yeah.
and my father's mother just has this rich history behind her that, like, oh my God, how come I didn't ask this woman any questions? And I never even asked my father, you know?
No, no. My mother didn't know much either. I mean, and it was interesting for me because only my mother's side is Italian, my dad's side is Irish. And so, I grew up in this household that even though I was only 50% Italian, it was really 100% Italian, because my dad's family was so scarce and so thin. But then in my maternal side, my maternal grandmother's family was the dominant one. My grandfather had no living relatives other than distant cousins that even came to the US. So all of them were back in Italy and other parts of the world, as I discovered. So yeah, it was dominated by my grandmother's family, and her parents came from the Campobasso region of Malaysia. So what I knew about Faleria was very, very limited before I started.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that. Well, Molise back then wasn't there, it didn't exist.
Right. It
Uh,
was
but
Abruzzo, right?
yeah, and but
Hmm.
there's a lot of people from that Campobasso area that I've probably interviewed, I don't know, three, four, something like that.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's basically when they carved up Italy, they kind of created a couple of territories, and I think some of them maybe even want to go back together again. Although I don't know if
Hmm.
they'll ever allow them to do that. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pittsburgh. I was born in Connecticut, but uh, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is the only area that I remember. And my grandfather worked in a steel mill for over 20 years. So my childhood, because we lived so close, my childhood was very much a grandparents and parents together, but it was always them. Not my dad was the outlier, the only Irish person to enter into this big network of Italians. So I admired his bravery.
That's funny. My dad's family. Well, his older brother, he was the oldest of the family. He married a non-Italian, but everybody else married Italians. And my
That's
mom's
right.
family, only her younger brother married outside the Italians, and my Aunt Margie was Scottish, and
Hmm.
she was actually a model back then. She was very, very pretty, my aunt.
Mm.
But yeah, it must have been really interesting for her to come into this family of nine brothers and sisters all the time.
Yeah, and my grandmother was one of eight children. So all the uncles and aunts and all of their children and everybody, that was the family that I grew up with.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, so well, I guess your father enjoyed Italian food. I'll tell you a funny story about my friend Tommy who lived around the corner from me. He married his wife was Italian, first generation. Her parents were born in Italy, and um, when it- Tommy went over there, I guess for the first time he was meeting the parents, and they had this big Italian dinner and stuff like that. He didn't want to portray the typical Irish, that they drink a lot. So
Hmm.
they asked him if he wanted something to drink, and he said milk. And they were like, milk? With spaghetti sauce? What are you crazy? And he didn't, I mean, he didn't drink a lot. And, she said, well, maybe have a glass of wine or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, it's funny like that. So now obviously you said you were back to the hometown. Have you been there more than once? And what was it like when you got there?
I had. It was hot. We went in July, and but that was my fourth trip to Italy, and the first two were really tourist kinds of things in the mid '90s. And I drove. We were in Venice and Rome and Florence and Naples, and I said I got to see this place, Faleria. Well, the first three people I asked about where it was, because that was pre-Garmin days, um, they didn't know. And so it was a challenge finding this little place. And we went there, and by the time we got there, it was like mid-afternoon. It looked like everything was closed. There were five guys sitting out front of a bar in the piazza, which I did not know was not a tavern. It was the coffee bar. But and I thought, oh, this is not Florence. So we went back 2 years later, and I thought maybe I missed something on the first trip. And so we spent about 10 minutes in Faleria, and I said, there's like not, I think it was the same guys sitting out front. Um, I said, now I know why he got out of there, because there's nothing going on here. Well, when I started digging into this and made a trip there specifically focused on doing the genealogy, I discovered I couldn't be more wrong. There was a lot going on. And it was then on my trip in 2023 that I got that sense of belonging, the initial sense of belonging. And after this most recent trip, it's off the charts. So first impressions are, not always right. But I went back in 2023 with my sister, and because we had done some Antonati work and some other things ahead of time, we kind of knew or thought we should go to the cemetery and photograph these headstones. Well, we did, and close to 2,000 photographs that we built into a database. And we really started to broaden our research from the direct family line to be more about Faleria. And we wanted to capture as many families as we could and link them together. So this is where I thought it was our initial approach to looking at our family was missing. It was missing all these connections to the other families. And the more I read, the more I found, the more I knew that I had to expand this. So, the manifests of alien passengers, when you'd see 4 and 5 and 6 names all coming from Faleria to New York, and you'd find them back and forth, and things, it just expanded my understanding of what these people must have been going through. And I found that my grandfather's story, although really important and really unique to me, was a story that was shared by so many in that village. They came to the same regions of the US. They didn't stop in New York. They went to Pittsburgh and West Virginia and Detroit and Akron, chasing the work. And sent money back, moved families over. I mean, it's the classic Italian story. And I wanted to share that story with as many families as I could find. So that's what we did. And on the first trip, we didn't realize that the diocesan records are not all the archives are not always in the diocesan headquarters. In this area, the diocese is headquartered in Civita Castellana, but we found out 2 days before we left that the archives are in Nepi. So on the follow-up visit that we did in July of 2024, we knew a lot more and got to work with the people in Nepi, and it's just been great. And there were 4 of us photographing, so I got a ton of information.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. I'm trying to do that with my uh mother's hometown in Torito. And I pick it up, I go back and forth. I did um put together a database that I forget the exact name of it now. I'll put it in the notes if I remember. But they allow you, it's really better than most of the typical databases that you get from Ancestry and those things because you could
Mhm.
kind of control things yourself, which is really pretty neat. The next generation, it's called TNG, and
Mm.
so yeah, I go back and forth when I have time. I go, I just sit there and try to look up records from Torito and put the names in there because you're right, those families were so interconnected in these small towns.
That's right. That's right. And the same thing that went on, like my grandfather when he came over in 1913, he came over with his older brother, who I didn't know. Um, but he came over with his older brother who had made 3 previous trips. Now, to do that, I couldn't wrap my mind around it initially. Most of those trips took about 10 days to 2 weeks, one way, going from Naples to New York. Then they had to take a train from New York to Pittsburgh, Detroit, wherever they were going. But they also had train trip on the Italian side because they're north of Rome. They had to go to Naples. So, and then he went back. Then he came back over to the U.S. and then he went back again. So he was back and forth, and you could see that he traveled with others, and he was almost like an ambassador, I guess. He what he learned and the areas to live and the areas to work, he would come back and tell the others in the village or in the comune that they could get work there, they could make money there. And they were all farmers. None of them were landowners of any consequence or merchants. They were all farmers, yet they worked in the mines and the mills and the factories. So it was amazing story as it unfolded. But I mean, I was so fortunate because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I experienced these big Sunday dinners and these homemade ingredients and the gardening and everything. In fact, one of my earliest childhood memories was when I graduated from the kids' table at my grandmother's into the adult table. Now, you,
So
you can
we've
experience.
all had that. We've all had that graduation. That's why I'm laughing.
Yeah, and it wasn't anything. I think it was only recently that I discovered the only reason why it happened was because my aunts and uncles had more children, and there was no more room at the kids' table, so they had to. So, but in any case, these kinds of things, the younger people today, no idea that. So, um, but I really wanted to tell you about this last trip, this trip in July. When you asked me if I would be interested in doing this in June before I left, I kind of thought that it was going to be a great trip because I'd gone before, I'd established these contacts, I'd made, uh, uh, I knew my way around and I knew my way through the records, and I was a little more experienced, even though I didn't speak the language. But this trip just far exceeded anything I could have imagined because not only did we reconnect with the people in Nepi who were so kind, laying out the records for us to work in, but then the mayor of Faleria and the consigliere, Nicola, were just so good. And Nicola, after we were there for a week, I had been in contact with him. He said, "I want you to do a presentation to the people of the comune." So right away, I thought, I know most don't speak English. So I created a PowerPoint presentation using Google Translate and put in a bunch of photographs of things. And I was just amazed. I have a photograph in the piece here that I hope you'll find as interesting as I did. That the crowd of people that came to this presentation just blew me away. And then the mayor presented me with this. I don't know if you can see it. Probably not. I'll send a photograph of it to you. And recognize me and so recognize the value of understanding our heritage and our ancestors. And then Nicola gave me this book about that was done by a scholar named Giuseppe Agnani that chronicles the story of the village. And I hope to use this story of the village woven into the stories of the families and produce something that I can give to the people of the comune. I'm not doing this to make money. I'm doing it to give it to them. All the database information, because all the records were destroyed. The roof of the church collapsed, rained, and I found that out from the people in Nepi that Faleria just had no viable records.
Oh, wow,
The
that's
state
something.
archives, the state archives had them, and there's some in the church, but a majority of them were destroyed.
Yeah,
So,
and what's so interesting about what you say is they are genuinely thrilled to have us there. I mean, we had a similar experience when we got to Capocota, where mass was ending, and so that town's 1,000 people, and I don't
mhm,
remember how many were in the mass, but there were maybe 200 or whatever it was. Um, and the priest said who we were and all of that, and nobody left.
right.
Nobody left the church. And then they asked me to talk, and of course I had to talk in English and have it translated. Um, but nobody left.
Mm.
It's really shocking.
It, it is, and the challenge for me is, I went there with a couple of questions, a couple of research questions. I'm a retired university professor, so I approached this with the diligence of academic rigor, but at the same time had to balance that with being, you know, conversive and informative and cordial and all those things. So it wasn't like a military operation where you go in and try to dig up all this data. But the people there, I mean, they were just so forthcoming. But yet, in order to get back further beyond the record keeping, we got to use DNA. And so few of them have tested. My basic, one of my research questions is about the surname. My grandfather's surname was Palamides, not what we would consider to be an Italian surname. Sounds more Greek than Italian. In fact, there was a big debate while we were over there whether it's more Spanish or Italian. So the score right now is there's six of us that think it's a Greek and four of us that think it's the Spanish. But in any case, I mean, I need DNA evidence to be able to prove that or disprove, and so few Italians test that it's going to be hard.
I know
But
they don't do the testing. Yeah, I know. I think I said this before. I had thought about bringing tests with me, and like
mhm.
seeing if I could get a couple of my cousins because I didn't know. My mother's family, pretty much everybody came. My father's family, almost only my grandmother and her aunt had come. So everybody's there.
Mhm.
My father's first cousins are still alive in their 90s. I didn't know any of this, none of it, until just a few years ago.
Mhm. Mhm.
And to find, you know, my dad's first cousins, just that blew me away. That just blew
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. My first cousin, who was born in 1934, I finally met him there. Um, and I tried to use Anthony's approach of getting the oral history right. And we sat down at his table with his wife and his daughter, and the consigliere was with us, and because he spoke a little bit of English. Well, I asked questions and I wrote them out and used Google Translate to translate the questions and then recorded them, hoping to take the audio recording and translate it. But everybody talked. No, I mean, everybody, they all talk simultaneously. So I can't extract, what he was telling me. I get a few words, but that's about it. So that experiment failed.
Well,
Um,
when I was doing my stuff, I have found out that on my mother's side, my oldest uncle didn't come until 1950 because he was left behind. And I found out that my cousin had recorded him in Varese before my uncle died. And
mm,
I asked my cousin, I said, do you have this? Did you translate it? And he said, no. He said, I did it. And then it was so heart-wrenching that I never really listened to it. And I said, Joey, you gotta translate this for us so the
mhm,
family knows. And his story was just so great because it's the history, his history being in my grandmother's town from when they left in 1915 until he left in 1950. So the war
wow.
years and how he met my
Oh,
aunt and
yeah,
all of that kind of stuff was just so fascinating.
right. And I mean, I learned anecdotally while I was there, about the struggles within the families, during fascism time, during Mussolini's time. There was a story about a German soldier during World War II had died in the village, and the lieutenant that was in charge of the area said, I'm gonna take 10 men, 10 of the locals, and shoot them in front of the church unless you tell me who did this, who killed him, who was responsible for his death. And the priest actually came out and said, no, shoot me, don't shoot them. And the German soldiers couldn't do it. So the priest saved these 10 men, and it was a story you could never imagine. And then in the piazza, um, uh, Piazza Garibaldi, by the way, um, the main piazza of town, there's a monument there. And apparently, after the war, they were trying to heal these divisions because some actually supported the fascists, and the country was polarized, and families were polarized. Um, and they went around to 6 or 8 of the little towns in the region and put these monuments up, recognizing that. And they had the Madonna, naturally in a parade and everything. They put these monuments there to help to heal, and to help unify people, saying, that was then. Let's get together as what we have in common, which is our religious beliefs and our Italian heritage. So
Yeah, well,
those stories you never
people
get.
people had to do what they had to do to survive. My uncle was lucky. He had been in the army before the war, the Italian army. Um, and then by the time the war broke out, I don't know if he had 2 or 3 children by then. So he was exempt. from
Mm.
going into the Italian army. So, they did, farming and stuff like that. And I guess that was, his part of the war. But they were in a town called Torito, which is outside. It's probably about a half hour from Bari by train.
Hmm.
So they weren't occupied by the Germans, but they could see when they bombed, the harbor and all of that. They used to see the planes come over and
That's right.
see the bombs dropping. And my cousin, who, she's in her 90s, so she remembers the war. She said, my grandmother would gather up when they saw the bombing, she would gather up all the kids and they would run into the field. Everybody run into the field because they were afraid that they would bomb the town, but they didn't.
It
They
didn't.
were they were lucky. They were lucky.
One of the photos that I really treasure that I've included in here for you is a photograph of my uncle, my mother's brother, who served in the U.S. Army and was part of the occupation of Italy after they invaded. I don't know because the U.S. military records were burned in that St. Louis fire. Um, I don't know whether he was part of the invasion force, that came through Sicily and then into Italy or not. But he has a photograph of him standing in the Piazza del Cucagna, where my grandfather was born, with with my grandfather's older two brothers and his sister and a cousin. And so one of the quests, I put the picture up on Facebook on the town of Faleria's Facebook page and said, "Does anybody know who that young lady is?" Well, that created a big stir, oh, it's her, no, it's her, no, it's her, and I know where that is. And I got to go to the place where that photo was taken, and you don't recognize it exactly because they added on to the building. So, but it showed that, the child, the son of the person who left Faleria came back, and he came back in 1945 to help free that country again. So it, everything I search, everything I find is like peeling another layer of the onion back, and it's going to keep me uh, occupied mentally, I think, and physically for the rest of my life.
So you like me? Does the family think you're nuts?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, my wife, and it appears that I've infected my sister and her daughter, so who accompanied me in July, and so they're captured. But my wife said that she has been looking at the back of my head now for the last 25 years, so and now I'm into this. So yeah, it's great. So funny story emerged while I was there doing the presentation. When I was there in 2023, we walked into a bakery, and the person that owned the shop, she spoke a little bit of English, and so there were other people in there, and she asked us where we were from, and so we exchanged a little banter, and she was translating for the other people in the shop. Well, by the time we walked out, there were five or six ladies standing out front who wanted to talk to us. And, we could understand little bits and pieces of what they said. And they said, "You have to talk to this man, Eugenio. He lives right there, And we tried to talk to Eugenio, who could understand only a little English. But I took a photograph of him from behind talking to one of the village elders who is in the second story balcony up there. And I used it in my presentation to say, when we were here last year, we got to interact with a few people, but not many. And so I included that photograph. Well, Eugenio came up to me after he attended the presentation. He came up to me after it and said, I didn't recognize me in that photograph because I didn't know I had a bald spot. And so, I mean, things like that just happened.
Yeah,
But
that's so funny. Our first trip. our first trip was like 20, almost 30 years ago now, and I didn't know any of this stuff. And again, my father had told me he had family in Torre del Greco and
Hmm.
saw a sign, but I wasn't really into it, and my son was a baby and all that, and then again, I could kill myself because had I known then what I know now, I would have been maybe not living in Italy, but I definitely would have had a place there. That's for sure. There's no
Uh-huh.
question about that. But we were in uh I don't know if we were in I think we were in I think it was Sorrento. Um and there was a butcher shop that said Sorrentino, And so I was just outside taking a couple of pictures, and the owner came out. And, I knew enough Italian, not that I know much, but I knew enough.
Hmm.
He's asking me, why I'm taking a picture. So I said, Sorrentino from America. So uh, he wasn't understanding, so I showed him my license, right?
Hmm.
And he goes, "Oh, Ashbed, Ashbed," and he go ran in next door to because the owner next door he spoke English, so he wanted to know where we were from, and so yeah, I mean this just from taking a simple picture, this and having the even though we weren't related, just having the same last name spurs them on to this whole conversation, and it's like I said, it's just an incredible experience to be there. And that first trip, I didn't, at one point, my wife said, oh, you love it here. And I said, well, I'm among my people, but I
Hmm.
really didn't feel that until you get immersed into it and you go to the towns and because of my grandmother, and her roots, they own property all over the place. And so when we went into these towns, it, they treated me like I was some long lost person that they had to engage with. It's foreign to us because we don't think of things that way, but they do.
They do. They absolutely do. And, one of the more meaningful things that happened is that when I corresponded with Carlo Ippoliti, the person who had his family line back to the 1400s from the Vatican research, after the presentation, he saw that when I talk about my grandfather, I get emotional. And so he came up to me afterwards and he gave me this hug and he said, "It's our blood." And people here, they don't understand it. The
No,
younger, especially, they just don't understand it. So, but a
I
funny
couldn't. I
story.
couldn't. When we were in the church, I couldn't. I couldn't talk.
Yeah.
I just. I couldn't talk. They had to rescue me.
Hmm. That's it. That's exactly it. I had to turn my back, on the audience and focus on other things. But my grandfather, he went back. He went back in 1972 with his wife and with her sister and her husband. And so it was the only time he ever went back to Faleria. And I asked him, yeah, I remember that. I wasn't there. I was in the Navy at that time. And so I asked him later, how was your trip? Did you enjoy it? And he said, yes, I enjoyed seeing my sister and my brothers again. His brothers passed the year following. So it was good that he went when he did. But he said it was his first and his last airplane ride. That was it. And I asked my grandmother what it was like for her, because that was not her village, that was his. And she said, oh, it was terrible because they were walking down the street and these ladies were hanging out the windows calling his name, hey, hey. They recognized him. Apparently, he was quite the womanizer in his early years. So she didn't care for that a whole lot. Yeah, yeah. He
And so now so what about your grandmother's family? Have you been able to how have you been researching them too? I suppose. Yeah.
I did a bit, and I encountered a guy who had done a lot of ancestry work and had developed a rather extensive tree on her side of the family. there's just so many of them. I mean, in contrast, um, I have a photograph of my great grand, and I knew her, my great grandmother, on
Wow,
her
that's
side.
super. Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
like for almost 15, 18 years.
Wow.
So um, she was a real character. But in any case, that family is just so large. But this guy Mike told me that he had gone to Campobasso, and that he said that all the people have all the older generation had left, or and the younger people, as soon as they were old enough, they would leave because there's no work, there's no challenge, there's nothing. But the intriguing part is the Samnites that settled that area. So I was hopeful again that DNA would maybe connect that chain, but that's I had to put that on the back burner to focus in on this part. And just like my dad and his family, it's so scarce here. It was so scarce in my life because I only knew my grandfather, no other relatives. Now the windows have opened, and I'm seeing a bunch of living relatives because they're still there. So that's particularly exciting for me.
Yeah, when we went to Capocota, there's a, a big Samnite ruins, just Pietro Bonante or Bonante. I can't, I'm killing the name. But we were met by a Samnite scholar. He's written two books on it, um, uh, Nicola Mastronardi, and he gave us a tour of the place. And he gave me his book, not that I could read it, but they was there too. He gave us like this brass plaque written in the Samnite language, and
Mhm.
we met the mayor of the town, and he gave us a thing. We had to buy that first trip. We had to buy a suitcase to bring all the books home because every town we went, they gave us two and three books about the town and the families and all of that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, I had never heard of the Samnites before we went on
No.
that trip, and
Mhm.
I just last month I gave a talk at the Italian Club on them, and then nobody else ever heard of them either. But they were a force against the
Oh,
Romans, and
oh
and
yeah.
and the Romans got a lot of their tactics from these people.
That's right. And they were a bunch of farmers, right? They were basically clannish farmers, no cohesive kind of government. And the other interesting part is that Faleria is located in an area with a lot of Etruscan ruins. So you have that element behind all the Roman history and everything. So it's just, as a fan of history, I guess I'm like overwhelmed. We have nothing like that in the US.
No, no, and
Yeah.
and in the ruins there, which of course predate Rome, we
Hmm.
sat in the amphitheater. The seats were the most comfortable seat that I ever sat in because they were so ergonomic the way they were
Huh.
done. They didn't have a back, but they made you sit up straight. It was unbelievable. I sat there. I
Yeah.
was like, I can't believe how comfortable this seat is.
You're sitting on a piece of stone.
Yeah, yeah, it was truly, truly amazing.
That's
That
right. That's right. It just,
probably close to 3,000 years ago or something like that, that
yeah,
they were able to
yeah.
do this. And yeah, I asked Nicola about it. I said, why, he's a historian type of guy, like we are interested in history. I think that's why we do this. But he said, my family is 500 years. The Samnites, so that's my heritage, you
Hmm.
know.
That's
Uh,
right.
and that's the way they think. They don't think only in the present, they think in the past.
That's right. I was envious of Anthony's stories because he talked about how they all lived together, and I remembered there was a Little Italy section in Pittsburgh, and that's how my grandmother and grandfather met. when he returned from the war, uh, she and her family lived there, and he rented a room. And he was 26 when they got married. She was 16. I found the consent form that her father had to sign for him to marry a child, basically, was the way it was written. But those places, I remember as a kid, it was like going to a foreign country. It was when you drove down this street, it was like you entered another world. And Anthony said something that stuck with me. He said, if I wanted to go back to the 18th century, all I had to do was walk downstairs, and that struck me because if you wanted to visit another country, all you had to do was drive down the street, and it was like a mile from my grandfather's house.
Well, and that's the way, where my parents grew up in Corona in New York. I don't know if did you ever see The King of Queens? Did you ever watch that show? I don't know if you ever
No,
saw it. There's a scene at the beginning where they go get a lemon ice, and it's from
mm,
the Lemon Ice King of Corona, where we lived. My grandmother lived just a few blocks from there, right by the World's Fair,
mm,
in New York. But it was, yeah, exactly like that. You walk down the street, and there was the Italian bakery, there was the Italian the sausage store, and then there was the vegetable place, and then there was the deli, and
hmm.
you'd walk down the block, and people would be talking Italian.
That's right.
There were very, very few non-Italians in this probably, I don't know, 10 or 12 square block area.
And you can see it in the US Census records. Now that they released the 1950 census records, I can see that street in Pittsburgh and see all those addresses and the people that were there, all Italian. I mean, it just, yeah, yeah. And the way that the census records were recorded incorrectly with the transcription errors and the spelling errors and everything else that makes searching really tough unless you dive in and actually look at the record itself, not just the transcript.
Yeah, it was probably it was at least 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more. I worked for Chase and this uh Khadidra, young black woman who worked for me, and uh I was living in Florida at the time. She was from Chicago, but we had a thing going on in New York, and we were walking, just the two of us were walking down the street in Little Italy in New York, and we were passing one of these, not a big bakery like Ferraris, but a small little, just, you walk in and you could probably touch each wall, right? That's how small this place was.
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh, you have to come in here." You have to, I said, "Come on, we're gonna go in here." So we walk in, and I said, "Take a deep breath." And and I said, "This is what it smelled like when I was growing up."
Hmm.
And she
That's
was
right.
like, "Really?" I said, "Yes, we would walk into a bakery, and this is what you would smell. This is what you would get."
Exactly.
I'm lucky. We have an Italian, we're in a small town in New Jersey, but there's a nice Italian bakery, um, like 3, 4 blocks from us, so like a real old style Italian bakery
Uh,
with everything,
I come back to the U.S. after a few weeks over there. It's oh man,
culture shock.
it's terrible,
And
terrible.
what's what we found over there, especially in Naples. Naples has the best coffee, the best pastry, hands down, if you ask me. But when their pastries, even though they have the same names, they look the same. They're so much lighter. There's not as much
Hmm.
sugar,
That's
uh,
right.
and they're not as like this heavy kind of filling thing, And the same thing with the food. There's three or
That's right.
four ingredients. That's all.
That's it. That's it. And it's not masked with all this other stuff, And in a way, I mean, when I see some Italian cooking shows with some of the modern chefs that try to use these exotic ingredients, and I think back, I mean, it was three or four things. They put it together, and it's magical. So one of the things I had to do, my sister, when we went in 2023, my sister had never been to Italy, so I had to introduce her to the four pastas of Rome. And I was very proud to buy her first Italian gelato. And so, and so, she's had gelato in the US, but then you have gelato in Italy, and you have bread in Italy, and you have pastries, and there's no comparison. So I've ruined her for the rest of her life.
Well, my daughter thought she was going to have the best fettuccine Alfredo that she ever had, and I had to break the news to her. I said it doesn't exist in Italy.
No, because you walk into a market, walk into your local Safeway or Kroger and ask for guanciale, right? See what you get, and you can't make Alfredo with cream. It has to be the pecorino. I mean, so simple ingredients, but so prepared so well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I have to ask you before we go
Yeah.
now, have you researched the Clarkin side?
So I researched.
The Clarkin side, your dad's family.
Yes, and in fact, I went to Ireland. I researched that as much as I could here in the U.S., but then I went to Ireland, and that's where his family, unlike most Irish families, a majority of them didn't marry, and they didn't come to the U.S. Only two of my great grandfathers, it was my great grandfather and his older brother, were the only two that came to the U.S. Settled in Norwalk, Connecticut, where I was born. My all the males died at a very early age, and there were 10 brothers and sisters from Ireland. Only two left. The rest of them never married. So that line just died off. It's from County Cavan and County Leitrim in Ireland, which are the least populated, central. They were flax workers and spinners and stuff. But that's where, when I went there and I walked the farmlands that they worked, that's where I got an initial sense of belonging. But nothing like Italy. Nothing like Faleria. It's, my Irish side is so small a part in my overall life. I did my job. I researched it as thoroughly as I could, but I didn't do it with the same zeal and passion and feeling of belonging that my Italian side has given me.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can understand that because you were so connected to them growing up.
Yes.
I mean, me having, four Italian grandparents, that was just normal, it's just
Yeah.
there was nothing else to even consider unless you had brought a friend over for dinner or something like that. And then they were like, what's
That's
all
right.
this food? What does it stop?
The other thing was, how I learned, and I learned from my grandfather as a child. I learned that those are the lessons I learned. And like so many others, he had no formal education. He couldn't read or write English, even to the day he died, which I can't understand how he became a naturalized uh, citizen, but I found out how they conscripted him into the army, and en masse they naturalized him before they sent him to the Musaya or Gom. But in any case, he taught me lessons that stick with me to this day. I remember working with him in the garden in the spring, turning the soil. And it was warm day and we were sweating and everything. And he said to me, "Have you seen your uncles today?" And I said, "No, no." He said, "Have you seen your cousins today?" I said, "No, I haven't." He says, "When it's time to work, you'll not see them. When it's time to eat, they'll show up." And that little nugget, it's so typical. Um, Never forgot it. And there's a whole bunch of those little nuggets of wisdom that he imparted on me. And to this day, he taught me more about the world and more about life, I guess, than his voyages to the U.S., then getting back on a ship. He was sick the whole time. He gets back on a troop ship to go to France, back on the troop ship to come back to America, which I'm glad he survived World War One, or I wouldn't be here. Um, it turned his hair white, and it was traumatic for him, but he survived it, and they nicknamed him Whitey, and that stuck with him for the rest of his life. But he was in my heart, as now the village of Faleria is. So
Yeah.
when I got on a plane, part of me stayed.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I just you hate to leave, as much as you want to come home, you really hate to leave. Like you said, you leave part of yourself there, especially, the country is beautiful, the food is great, but the people to me were just fantastic.
And the pace of life, pausing to appreciate the smells and the views and everything. And I learned that the farmers of Faleria were not vegetable farmers, cultivating these big fields. It's pretty mountainous there. But when you look out over these forests, it's hazelnut trees, and this is the primary area for Nutella to come in and harvest these hazelnuts. So they farmed the hazelnuts, which is right now, I guess September is harvest season. So you don't want to talk to anybody right now because they're busy. They're
Mhm.
working, and that hasn't changed for how many years.
Well,
So,
yeah, and that's when we were in Fasato, one of the towns. Um, they made everything.
mhm,
The capicola was made by them. The bread was made by
mhm.
them. The olive oil was made by them. The wine was made by them. Nothing was bought in the store. And
That's
yeah,
right.
I never had ham like this before. And they said, well, we still do it the same way we did it 300 years ago. Uh we kill the pig on the day after Christmas, and then
Mhm.
we hang it for 3 months, and in March we eat it. And it was just like so nonchalant.
Right.
This is the
It's
way
what we
we do
do.
it.
It's what we do. And you mean you don't do that? It's what we've been doing for 300. How do you do it? Oh yeah, well, we go to Kroger and get a package.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they still there was a game that was kind of like a bowling game, only there was, they was small little ball like a bocce ball, and you're
Hmm.
rolling the thing down this rocky path. It's not a smooth thing. And the other thing that they did, they were masters of spinning tops. And and
Mm.
and I had no idea that this is like a worldwide thing. And I forget if they put it in the palm of your hand or on the back of your hand, I don't remember. But they would spin a top, and then they place it on your hand, and then you had to hold it there as long as you could. They would time it, and to see who could hold it the longest. And they said, like the record was 2 minutes and 30 seconds or something, some crazy number like that. Uh, yeah, they just do these things,
Yeah,
forever, forever.
forever. And the reason why the shops are shut is because it's too hot. So they close them in the afternoon, but then everybody comes out of their house, when the sun goes down. And that's when they're sitting outside and they're talking in the piazza in these little areas with tables that were vacant in the afternoon. They're full of people in the evening. They don't sit there watching TV. They talk to one another.
Yeah, they were all talking outside my window in Body at two
Oh, you're
o'clock in the
trying to
morning.
sleep?
Yeah. We were like, don't they ever go to bed? And they did eventually. But well,
Yeah.
listen, John, this has been so much fun, fantastic stories, and I really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thank you, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I mean, I've enjoyed your conversations with others so much, and it's it's a welcome break from the tedium of recording all these records and things. It brings it to life. And so thank you for doing that. And thank
That
you
was,
for doing what you do.
that was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.